Good morning and welcome to today's webinar as we pose the thorny question that has dominated our collective imagination for decades, with our worst fears often played out on screen and in literature. Can we trust AI? This morning we are delighted to be joined by John Higgins, who will be examining whether public trust aligns with business trust in AI and how policymakers in the UK, EU and beyond are responding. Will the fear of AI lead to over-regulation and loss of opportunity? Are early adopters running a risk? And what can be done to build trust? As President of the BCS, the UK's Chartered Institute of IT, Chair of the Global Digital Foundation, and a Senior Advisor to global communications company Burson Cohn Wolfe, John is immensely qualified to speak on this topic. Before we begin, let me introduce myself. I'm Charlotte Dorbrashley, and I manage the FS Club here at ZN. And it's with thanks to our very generous sponsors that we can continue to bring you a wide range of thought-provoking content across finance, technology, and economics. Some brief housekeeping points. We'll be holding a 20-minute Q&A session after John's presentation, so please use the GoToWebinar chat facility to send your questions in to me so I can feed them into the conversation. Right, that's all from me. Over to you now, John.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us for this 20-minute discussion from me and then 20-minute Q&A, as Charlotte said. Thank you very much, Charlotte, for that kind introduction. We've got a couple of polls we want to ask you to take part in as well. So you have to stay alert and stay with it because you've got to answer some questions. I want to try and cover 4 points and pick up those things that Charlotte mentioned in her introduction on the way as I do these things. So first of all, AI, what is it? How is it used? Not so much a sort of technical presentation of definitions, but really just what I've seen it, how I've seen it being used at the moment. So that's the first thing. Second, what shaped my thinking and a bit of the context to some extent, so you know whether to pay any attention to what I say or not, really. So you can make a judgment about that. Third thing I want to cover is what are politicians thinking? You might say, who knows? I don't. But we'll have a guess at that. What are politicians thinking? And finally, leave you with a little bit of so what? You know, so what does all that mean? But first of all, we've got the first poll for you. Let's ask you to answer some questions. So, do you trust algorithms to make decisions that affect your life? And asked you to choose one of those four. No middle ground for you, I'm afraid.
We'll just leave that up for a minute or so, everyone answers.
Yeah. Well, people think about that while I crack on. So what about this first thing? What is AI? How is it used? I was talking recently to a colleague of mine who's just joined as the Chief AI Officer. That's interesting. Occasionally, 68%, mostly 20%. Some never, and none of you always. Interesting. We'll come back to that a little later. Thanks for that. A colleague of mine joined WPP as the Chief AI Officer. WPP is the, as you know, the holding company for lots and lots of companies, including one, BCW, Burson Cohn Wolfe, that I act as a senior advisor to from time to time. I was asking Daniel, how did he think of AI? I mean, he's an academic, UCL, deeply involved in the subject, and he categorizes it in three different parts. The first he thinks of adaptive systems, which have been around quite a long time, so what I would have thought of as process control, where some sort of feedback from the system changes the way the system operates. The second is true sort of machine learning. That's where, the classic example here is the systems that can recognize whether a picture is a dog or a cat, by constantly sort of feeding lots of pictures in, the system learns. So it really is learning from the data. And the third one he treats in the category of its own sort of chat boxes and things that might almost look like human beings on the end of a phone. I think that's quite an interesting way of looking at AI. And as you'll hear later, this definition of what is AI and what isn't is quite relevant when it comes to, do we regulate AI? Because clearly, if you don't have a crisp definition, that the edges of what you're regulating can get a little bit messy. Some recent experience from me about AI, though. I act as a mentor at my local innovation accelerator, and I was doing a thing recently with a bunch of companies who were preparing to pitch for some money, and there were all a variety of different businesses in some quite esoteric things, including one I remember that struck me, that tested for leakages in the gas pipeline and adjusted, helped the operators to adjust the pressure in the national gas pipeline network in order to reduce leakage. Apparently, it's a big problem. And these guys sort of casually threw in, oh yeah, and of course we use machine learning to do that. And that was true for all the presentations. By and large, they all refer to the fact that we're using machine learning in some way, shape or form as part of their business. And it really struck me, you know, how in that sort of novel SME business community, the how pervasive AI is. Of course, we've all seen what's going on with DeepMind. You know, first it was AlphaGo, and then it was protein folding. And I don't know if you've spotted recently this new thing they've done, the Alpha Code, and that really is quite clever stuff. Where now the AI that they developed has to read a problem. You know, it has to read in natural language a problem, and then try and design some code to actually tackle that problem. So it's analyzing written text and then producing some code. And I think the people who run these competitions were really quite amazed at how good it was. It was still only in the median amongst other coders, but nevertheless, incredible step forward. And you could say that these are really just steady steps in what is narrow AI. And I used to argue this. I used to argue, well, this is just automation. It's just general purpose technology like any other. But to be honest, I'm now not quite so convinced about that. And I ask myself, well, what specific thing can't AI do, or won't it be able to do quite soon? I was over in Zurich not that long ago, you know, possibly just before lockdown, and I was talking to some of the developers there from Google, actually, and there was one part where they were saying, oh, and the AI did this, and then it did this, and we really didn't think it was going to do that. You know, it's like, really? I mean, if it's surprising you, that's quite interesting. So I joined this network called the Economic Singularity Club, and the sort of intellectual leadership of this club is a guy called Callum Chase, and he's written a lot about AI in the next 30 or 40 years. And we've explored quite a lot, you know, in some rich debates, I think, between about 20 of us, what we think is going to happen over the next 30 or 40 years. Now, I would recommend that you look, you know, if you're interested in it, look at Callum's books and look at the next 30 to 40 years, because, and ask yourself then that question, okay, well, what can't AI do? What is it not likely to be in due course? I'm not talking about the next 5 or 10 years, but over 30, 40 years. Interesting thing to be thinking about. And I would, you know, anybody who's interested, I'd recommend you do that. But that isn't really what I want to talk about today. I do want to talk about the next 10 years. And I think the working assumption is that AI is a sort of automation. It might be a bit of a special case of general purpose technology automation, but for the next 10 years, I think that's going to be my working assumption anyway. I think we could all, you know, that'll be enough, really. We've got enough to think about just with that. Let me move then to that sort of, then move on, the second bit. So what's formed my views? Where am I coming from? So I was the Director General of Digital Europe. It's the tech industry association that represents tech industry views into European policy making. I did that for a while. This year is my year, it's almost coming to an end now, as the president of the BCS, which is the professional body for IT practitioners, largely in the UK, but with many international members as well. And these are people who work in digital across the piece. You know, they could be working in financial services, the MOD, NHS. They could be working for IBM. You know, they're all over the place. And but they all have one thing in common, is they want to be professional in what they do as practitioners. And by professional, we mean competent, yes, but have ethical values and feel accountable for what they do. And we'll come back to that professionalism thing in a little while. But that's the BCS thing. And the BCS purpose is to make IT good for society. And that's a theme that we have in the foundation I chair, the Global Digital Foundation. It's we all just really believe that tech's good stuff and it can be used to good effect for economic benefit and societal progress. But there are bumps in the road, and it's not all straightforward. And there are some things we're really going to have to scratch our heads about. So let's really think about those things and tackle them in order that we can make sure that IT is good for society. We're not naive about it. But we work hard and think about those questions, and I think that's a common theme in the BCS community. So those are the things that are really shaping my view. I also I'm lucky enough to chair a small tech company that uses AI to make open source cloud effective, make it work for people. And so it's good to also have that practical experience of seeing it actually play out with customers in real life situations. So those are the sorts of things that, if you like, shape my background. So you can see I'm not an AI specialist, but I've worked with lots of different technologies and the impact of those technologies on society and in many different parts of the world. Yes, largely over the last few years in a European context, but not just that. A little bit then, another sort of aspect of context that I want to look at is like, where does AI fit in the scheme of things if you're a CIO? Where are you spending all your waking moments thinking about AI in my business? And I think the answer to that, based on a recent survey we carried out at BCS, is no, it's not top of the list, but it's actually getting up there quite close. So the two big things, and you might expect this, that are on the CIO's mind, what are their CEOs getting onto them about, pointing, get this done, get this done. And the two big things are business transformation and operational efficiency. Well, operational efficiency has always been the thing, get this tech done, but more cheaply, please. But business transformation is really what it's all about. Use technology to transform my business. And recognizing that this is a financial services club, probably the only reference to sort of financial services is this one. I had some experience a few years ago with one of the big banks, and they were very concerned about the developments that arose from the Payment Services Directive, which is really, I think, inadvertently opening up payment services to the big tech companies. I don't think that's what they had in mind originally when politicians came up with this in Europe. It was more to open it up to SMEs, but open the door a crack, and the big tech companies are very happy to step through. Thank you very much. And in the course of doing this work, I came across a report from Bain, and I sort of have to whisper this in case Alexa in the other room picks this up. But the subtitle of this report is "Alexa, move my bank account to Amazon." And the real the report, a nice little subtitle, but the real fear was that tech companies were moving into the sort of financial services space. And this Bain survey showed that more than 50% of consumers would be quite happy to take banking services from a tech company, with Amazon leading the way. And if you think about it, you can immediately see the logic of it, because Amazon know all about my trading history. They know what sorts of things I buy. They know how much I spend on stuff. Why can't they offer me better payment term? They could offer me a loan at a better rate. And the things that banks hated about this, and maybe there are some of you from banks in the audience, the things the bank hated was Amazon able to exploit the data that they had, but the banks couldn't access this data, so that was a real annoying thing. So you can see why business transformation, and that was the big focus for this particular bank. Okay, well, we're going to have to be as good as the tech companies, and so you can see why business transformation is on the mind of most organizations, and that's what they want from tech. But what technology are they asking the CIOs to turn to? Well, to some extent, they're agnostic. I don't care what you use, we use whatever you have to. But if you ask the CIOs, what are the technologies that are uppermost in their minds, as we did in our survey, number one still, and it has been for a little while now, is cloud computing. So this use it as a service. I don't want my own infrastructure, or if I do want my own infrastructure, I want to use it in a very efficient way, which is in a sort of cloud-like manner. Always sort of neck and neck in these last few years, and it still remains the case, cybersecurity technologies, because obviously you have this great stuff and you're terrified of all the things that can go wrong. I take part in a conference every year, at least the last year or two virtually, called the Munich Cybersecurity Conference. Takes place the day before the Munich Security Conference, and it's grown and grown and grown. I mean, we get really big hitters coming along to this conference. So as you know, cybersecurity. But in third and fourth place, sort of a bit neck and neck these days. And I think, coming back to my earlier definition, also you could argue they're in the same sort of vein. Third and fourth are business process automation and AI. So they are coming up there. The CIOs are beginning to use this more and more as a sort of top priority technology for everyday use. So it's not, and as I said at the beginning, with my experience with the mental companies, it's all pervasive now. It's being used more and more. This is not some sort of science fiction thing, but it really is with us. Let's turn to that trust issue about AI then. So we've learned that it's with us. We learned that the edges are, or if you believe me anyway, the edges are a little bit vague. What do people think about it? Well, I asked you what you thought about it, and nobody wanted algorithms to be used to make judgments about their lives all the time. Occasionally, yeah, okay, but not even mostly. And you're probably thinking in that, because these questions always, people interpret them in different ways. I don't mind them choosing my Netflix recommendation, but I'm not so sure I want them making predictions about my kids' A-level results. And indeed, that was what we found when we did a survey a couple of years ago after our wise government decided to use an algorithm to predict A-level results. And there was, of course, an outcry about that. And in our survey, we found that 54% of people did not want algorithms making choices about their lives. If you add into that a bit of tech clash anyway, because in most people's minds, they don't really distinguish between an IBM, Microsoft, and SAP, and a Google, Facebook, Twitter. I mean, it's all big tech. And I think as a result of that, we saw last year in the Edelman Trust Barometer, don't know if you follow this, but I'd recommend it if you don't. In the Edelman Trust Barometer, trust in our sector really dipped last year. The tech sector was always the most trusted business sector. Trusted surprisingly more than governments, more than any other sector. But it really dipped last year, and we were down there, with financial services in the middle ranks. It fell. But I'm pleased to say it returned a little bit this year, but I think that's in part because they stripped out social media companies. Trust in social media companies is the lowest of all sectors. If you add into that a bit of general tech lash and a bit of, I have to say, politicians thinking about AI influenced by the movies that they've seen rather than, any scientific research, you can understand why then you get this sort of political nervousness, because it reflects popular nervousness. I mean, where popular sentiment goes, the politicians soon follow. I have to say, to be fair, in Europe, there's that group, the centre-right group, the EPP. They also nearly always play out arguments about Europe's economic competitiveness and so on. So I don't wish to belittle all political thinking as being populist. I think there is a group that is genuinely concerned with the competitive position of the economy, whether that's the country or Europe. So what are the politicians doing? Well, what the EU is doing is they are driving forward with something called the EU AI Act, and some of you might have been following this. But what this act does essentially is put obligations on things called providers, and providers are people who put AI systems on the market. So you know, in Europe, there's this concept of the internal market. So if you're going to put an AI system that does something using machine learning and so on the market, then you will have to comply with certain, you'll have to meet certain regulatory obligations. But also, it's not just providers, and so look out for you if you think, well, that doesn't affect me because I don't put technology on the market. It affects people who bring AI into service. So I think if you're a financial institution, a railway operator, you bring a piece of AI into service in your operation, you will be affected by it. Where are we in the process? Well, the Commission produced a draft of the Council. That means the member states have been kicking it about for the last few months, and now the Parliament's got involved. And I spoke only yesterday to Brando Bonifi, who is who's the MEP who's leading the charge on the Parliament. I also spoke to another prominent MEP, Axel Voss. Axel said, and I think he hit the nail on the head a little bit yesterday when he said the concerns that he thinks Parliament are going to have is, and he's from that centre-right EPP group. He doesn't want to ignore the risk that regulation will impair Europe's competitive position. That's the researchers and the digital community. So, you know, he will be sort of trying to play that card. He thinks the definition of AI is currently too broad and it needs to be narrowed. He thinks the definition of high risk is too broad, will have to be narrowed. And he thinks the issue of liability will need to be dealt with in the Act, and it isn't at the moment. Well, you might say, well, okay, well, that's Europe. When, you know, Brexit, who cares what Europe's doing? But what's very interesting is that other geographies, and including the US, are now working much more closely with the EU, and under the leadership of the Federal Trade Commission, with this doughty new leader, Lina Khan, who, as you know, did some very critical work on Amazon and on digital markets. I mean, she's very much in line with the EU thinking. So I think the US is going to go down this sort of route soon. And if you look at the guidance that companies are getting in the US, it's very similar. Prove there's no bias, be transparent, make sure you're using human oversight, keep good records. I mean, all things you might think are not unreasonable, but if you layer on all the certification that's needed on top of that, it's going to bring some challenges. What's the UK doing? Good question. I think in the UK, the ecosystem, if I can call it that, is responding in a similar sort of way, you know, in that it's promoting trustworthy AI. You see lots of references to it. AI that's based on an ethical approach. At BCS, we've been arguing for professionalism as a part of that. We think that if you have competent, ethical and accountable individuals involved in the development and deployment, that's an important piece of the jigsaw. I'm not sure we will in the UK go to the same extent of bringing in horizontal regulation. But what do you think? I'm going to ask you that second question in the poll now. Do you think we should? Can we please have that second question up? So should the use of AI, not AI itself, the use of AI in the UK, should it be subject to new horizontal regulation as distinct from being captured by sector regulation? What do you think? Yes for all, yes for high risk, or not at all? Interested to know what you think about that. So while you're reflecting, let me move on to just my, the last few comments on this. So I think basically the UK, okay, yes for all, yes for high risk. Okay, well, I think the UK government is probably listening to you, and I think we'll end up in the yes for high risk. Even in that bastion of if it moves, regulate it place, you could argue in Europe, even they aren't going to go yes for all. They're going to go yes for high risk, and they're going to be quite careful about what high risk is. I think they will encourage other uses of AI to, as it were, voluntarily state that they have got no bias, that they've got human oversight and so on. But I don't think even in Europe, they're not going to regulate for low risk. When you think about that, answering that question, do you really want Netflix's recommender algorithm to be regulated? I'm not sure I do, really. So what should we do? I'm just going to pick out 2 or 3 random things. So the foundation I chair has been looking specifically at the issue of compliance in the supply chain, or assurance in the supply chain, because one of the things we realized, because a couple of companies came and talked to us about it, is that if you're a provider putting AI on the market, okay, yes, I comply with the regulations, yep, we do that. Oh, but hang on, how can I be sure that my supply chain does? I've just bought that data set from someone else. How do I know they've made sure that there's no bias in it? Oh, wait a minute, all that's available open source. Who the hell controls that? So the issue of compliance in the supply chain, which in other industries like aerospace, defense, aviation, aerospace, defense, automotive, is quite well documented, but they're quite precise supply chains. In AI, the supply chains are complex, and it's all very well to say you're a provider, comply with the regulations, but when you look behind it, you've got, frankly, a mess of a supply chain. So we're looking at trying to bring companies together who are interested in trying to sort that out and get some practical guidelines. Because the other thing that will happen, believe me, is if we don't do that, what you'll have is the big companies will be saying, okay, well, here, SME, could you just fill in this 28-page form to show that you comply with the way we do things here in, and I'll just pick an example, here in Microsoft, here in Google, here, and they'll all be different. So you poor SME, you're really going to suffer if we don't put some standards in. Second point, nearly done. Second point here is, how do you make sure that your use of AI stays on the right side of the cool stroke creepy line, as I call it? So I gave a talk recently to all the IT people in a retail pharmacy chain that we all know and love, without telling who it is. And the AI team said, oh, yeah, we're really looking at using AI in our business, but don't worry, we're not going to do anything spooky. And I said, how do you know? How do you know that what you think is spooky is going to be the same as what your customers think is spooky? Because that line is moving all the time. It's very difficult to judge. And I think staying on the right side of that line is going to be really important. If you think about that and you think, oh, I want to stay on the right side of the line, look at the guidelines that Innovate UK and the Digital Catapult have come out with recently. They're a sort of version of the EU AI Act, but I think they are quite usable. So, I think, if you do things like follow their guidelines, you've got a fighting chance of being able to hold on to that reputation. And the last thing, coming back to my, putting my BCS hat on, is use professionals. I mean, demand that the people who are writing algorithms, ask them, what are their professional, demonstrate that they are competent, ethical, and accountable, and you only use people who are prepared to stand up to their sort of ethical values. And finally, don't leave it to the techies. The business people, as business people, you have to be involved. You have to understand the implications of what you're doing. You can't just say, well, it won't wash as an excuse either. In either in the court of a public opinion or anywhere else. Oh, I don't understand this stuff, so I left it to the techies. So it's really, we want to be able to trust AI, but guys, if you're in the business, it really is up to you to make sure that that is the case. Thanks very much. I hope we can have some good debate now.
Thank you so much, John. I think everyone would agree that was a fascinating and pragmatic presentation. I think the consequences of following the AI's decision is what's really important. We're fine to lose an evening to a bad movie on Netflix, but when it affects what university you can attend and has much stronger implications for the future, that's when it can be quite concerning. But we've got a lot of questions coming through. So we'll start with Atif Sawa, who's asked, how is trusting AI different from trusting an expert professional, as both can be biased?
And do we want to try and take these sort of individually? I mean, I think the fact is, in a sense, can we trust AI is a bit of a daft question, isn't it? Because AI is only the summary of the data sets it's been fed with, or the way the algorithms have been designed. So as we know, any system that we build will reflect our biases, whether they are unconscious or conscious. So what I've seen over the last couple of years is a lot more awareness of this. I mean, a great example of a little AI system that I think it was like a health club had bought to control access to their changing rooms, and a woman signed in, a Dr. Smith, let's call her, she was Dr. something. It wouldn't let her in the female changing rooms because obviously, I mean, doctors are men. I mean, so I mean, you build those simple, stupid biases that you build in, but there are human biases. They're not intrinsic in the. Yeah, so I'm with the question. I mean, it's really we've got to get those and you know, do unconscious bias training and all sorts of things, and that's part of the professional development. When you're learning these ethical values, you have to learn, well, how does that play out in what I do in my work?
Yeah, and having a diversity of people creating.
Of course. Yeah. No, that's one of our big themes in BCS is EDI, is the equity, diversity, and inclusion. And I mean, I've come to learn a lot about this in the last couple of years, even that it's not just a societal nice to have. You really do get better products at the end of it, you know, that match the market. So you know, like, why wouldn't you?
And moving on to regulation now. So Volker Dow asks, how can AI avoid or mitigate the threat of regulation with its attendant cost and bureaucracy over the next 10 years?
But if by that, you know, how can we avoid regulating AI? I don't know that we can. And I think in the financial services market, as an example, businesses have thrived as a result of the legal certainty that comes with regulation. So these things are always a balance. You know, you know, as we all know, these are deeply held political views that people think, no, everything should be unregulated and left to the market, and other people think no. In fact, this was one of the things I learned first when I went to Brussels. It took me a little while to get this, but the sort of Franco-German approach to things is don't do anything until there's a regulatory framework in place. And the Anglo-American approach is let's see how it goes. And if there are market failures, we'll regulate to fill the gaps. Then it is a fundamental difference in approach. And you know, almost one of my first experiences in Brussels was meeting the then French, well, Michel Barnier, meeting him and him wagging his finger at me, literally talking about, we don't want any more of this Anglo-American free market nonsense over here. And it's quite an experience. But actually, I am on the side of we do need light touch regulation in order to create confidence in AI. And the figures stand for themselves at the moment. People don't trust it, and we need to do something. We need to do something to rebuild that trust. And if that takes light touch regulation, so be it. And I don't buy all the stuff about Brussels wants to regulate, you know, willy-nilly. I think there are strong voices on both sides, and no one wants heavy-handed regulation that's bureaucratic. You know, you've got, well, I say no one. I think the vast majority don't.
Great. Graham Elliott asked, will AI be able to replace various kinds of business and legal consultancies, and how might this appear?
This is the sort of stuff we talk about in the Callum Chase group, the economic singularity. And there was also a very good in fact, the first piece of work that scared everyone was the bit that was done by a couple of researchers, Bray and Osborne, I think they were, in Oxford, who looked at different jobs and how they would be affected. And that really, I mean, go look that up. I think it's a little bit dated now, but you basically takes job by job and says how will it go. But I'd put the question back and say, well, what do you do that you know, if you're in financial services, legal services, what do you do that couldn't be done? You know, what if you think about a sort of complex enough algorithm? And I'm afraid to say there isn't much. You know, there isn't much that I've listened to music written by algorithms. I've read poetry written by algorithms. You know, certainly seen loads of good examples in the medical field of algorithms being used to detect cancers or retinal problems with diabetes, all sorts of things. So yeah, enjoy it while you can. I mean, if you've got a job in consulting, financial, you know, in management services of some sort, make the most of it while you can. The AI is coming for you.
It's coming for all of us, isn't it?
Yeah.
Charles Escott has asked, do you believe there's a solution to cybersecurity risk, or will it be an eternal arms race between developers and hackers?
The latter, I think. I chaired a conference for one of the big cybersecurity companies. Well, it was a few years ago now. But one of the things I found really scary was a slide that was put up showing the supply chain in the bad guys community, if we put it that, and how sophisticated it was. You know, what a well-developed market it is. The hackers, the fraudsters, how much you can buy. I mean, it's terrifying. And so I think, yeah, arms race. And actually, at this conference, I remember now there was somebody from financial services saying, "Oh, I think we've got it cracked in financial services. We're okay." And I thought, wow, really? That's a terribly arrogant and not very well-founded thing to say. So I looking at the number of people who turn up at Munich every year for this conference and the things that concern them, I think it continues to be a big problem. But interestingly, you know, human behavior and the stupid things we do are still the largest cause of cybersecurity breaches. You know, sticking passwords on yellow stickies and leaving them on the screen and all that sort of stuff.
So looking at governance, Hugh Pearce has asked, so enforcing the regulations could lead to very protracted legal battles. So to avoid this, legal definitions are going to have to be very narrow. Do you agree with that statement?
Yeah, yes, I do. And I think there's if anybody has a view on the definition of this, I think now is the time to get it in. I mean, the debate is happening right now about how, in Europe anyway, how do we define high risk, and also in the US, I think, with Department of Commerce and the FTC, how do we define high risk and AI within high risk? You will, I think some of you will know that the precursor to the AI Act was something called the AI high-level group of experts that was assembled in Brussels, people from a legal background, academia, industry, and so on, where they really tried to work very hard on a very tight definition of AI and of high risk, but the debate still continues. So I totally agree. And you see that repeatedly, don't you? I mean, if the thinking is unclear, if the definitions are unclear, I mean, there is this thing they say, it's called, what is it called? Policy making through the courts. Okay, well, we'll leave it to the the EU Court of Justice. I forget the exact name of it. It's not the, anyway, the European courts to adjudicate, you know, because they'll sort out the detail. I think that's a very sloppy way, and that's seriously frowned on by smart policymakers.
Madeline Moons asked, how do we ensure that societal values are embedded into AI machine learning rather than the bottom line costs and the interests of the company? So how do we put the safety, quality, and standards sought by society at the top of those values?
Well, I think embedding those values into people who are making the business decisions, first of all. I mean, for our part in BCS, what we're trying to do is inculcate professional values into the IT and digital profession, into the algorithm writers. So you could imagine a scenario where the CIO refuses to build an algorithm. I mean, obviously people would get it, but the extreme example is the IT team says no. I mean, do you see that to some extent, don't you, in Facebook and, you know, in Google employees say, no, we're not going to work for Department of Defense, or so. And this debate's going on in Spotify at the moment, isn't it? Where, you know, the employees are being encouraged to, as it Neil Young said, leave the company now while you've still got a soul, or something. So you do see these debates. You do see these debates going on, but I think it's about getting the values into the companies, the leadership. So through the IOD and CBI, they have to have these values, and then the professionals who are implementing the IT decisions have to then live those values as well. And for our part, that's what we're trying to do. You know, we can get people to have those values themselves. That's the way to do it.
Right, I think we've got time for one more question, but if we haven't got to yours this morning, we'll send these directly to John so he can get in touch and answer you. So Cullen Graham has asked, with the volumes of code in many procedures, now like 500,000 lines of code in a recently compromised shell module, this is rising beyond the purview of humans. So how soon do we need AI to supervise AI, or are we already at that level?
I think we are, to some extent, already at that level, and I think that the things that DeepMind did with Alpha Code are really trying to push the boundaries of that. But yeah, we are already at that level. I only recently came across a movement called the low code movement, which is, you know, trying to, or perhaps movement is too strong a word, but, you know, there's a whole thing called low code. And in fact, on our list of technologies that we ask CIOs about, it does figure on there. It's actually higher up than metaverse and blockchain, by the way. So if you think meta and blockchain are coming things, well, the CIOs don't agree with you. But yeah, but answer to that question, I agree. It's getting to the point where it's beyond our capabilities in our own lifetimes to be able to look through all those lines of code.
Thank you very much. Apologies if we didn't get time for your question. We will send those to John, as I mentioned. So thank you so much again, John, for sharing your time and expertise with us. And also, once again, thanks to our wonderful sponsors for making these webinars possible. And of course, thank you to our lovely audience for all of your time and contributions this morning. If you do want to keep up to date with the latest developments in AI, regulatory, technological, and everything in between, you can sign up to receive our AI bulletin by following the link in the chat box. And do join us again next week for more webinars, or catch up on our YouTube channel. And remember, you can now get your FS Club fix on your favorite podcast app. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.